It's estimated that 120 million Americans feel isolated or alone. To give this number some context, I want you to imagine standing every lonely American on top of one another. At the top of this human tower, the highest person would reach halfway to the moon. In our hyper-connected and social media-obsessed world, we have more friends than ever. So you might think that loneliness is declining, but the opposite is true. In fact, in the last 20 years, America's problem with loneliness has grown by roughly 80%. This epidemic is alarming when you consider the long-term consequences of loneliness. That's because researchers compare the effects of loneliness to the harm caused by high blood pressure, lack of exercise, and obesity. And as a result, lonely people die younger and have higher incidence of heart disease and dementia. And if that wasn't bad enough, there's also a strong correlation between loneliness and the onset of depression and anxiety disorders. Personally, I know this story all too well. After an 8-year relationship came to an end, I spent the better part of 2 years struggling with loneliness, and this period was one of the most challenging phases of my life. Thankfully, I won my battle against loneliness, and in the process, I learned some of the most valuable lessons of my life. So in this video, I'm going to share those ideas with you, and with any luck, the ideas in this video will prevent loneliness from taking over your life. Let's get started. I want to start by talking about why we feel lonely and when loneliness becomes a problem. And I want to start here because I think most people struggle with loneliness because they don't understand these concepts. For me personally, these concepts changed my life and ultimately ended my struggle with loneliness. So to explain why we feel lonely, let's start by talking about emotions in general. We feel emotions because they help us survive. And to understand this point, I want you to consider fear. Fear makes you feel unsafe, and then that feeling motivates you to find safety, which in turn increases your odds of survival. To give you an example, if you're in a burning building, fear lets you know that you're in danger, and then that feeling motivates you to escape to safety. This concept also applies to positive emotions like pleasure. So if you eat a delicious meal, then your brain releases dopamine, which feels good, and then that feeling motivates you to continue eating delicious food in the future, which again increases your odds of survival. When I first started feeling lonely, I didn't understand this concept, so I didn't view loneliness as a helpful emotion that was sending me an important message. Instead, I viewed loneliness as a horrible feeling that I hated and wanted to get rid of. Unfortunately, at the same time, some of the people around me led me to believe that it was wrong to feel lonely, and this belief only made my problem worse, because every time I felt lonely, it just reinforced the belief that there was something wrong with me. Eventually, this pattern of feeling lonely and believing something was wrong with me spiraled out of control, and I ended up feeling depressed. And that's when loneliness became a problem, because once I was depressed, I let how I felt influence my behavior. To give you an example, I was less likely to go out, and even when I did, I wasn't myself. I was less outgoing and less talkative, and as a result, people wanted to spend less time with me, which, ironically, made me lonelier. Thankfully, I had a turning point when I read the book Loneliness by John Cacioppo and William Patrick. In their book, the authors explain that it's perfectly normal to feel lonely in many situations, and that's because loneliness, like fear, is an emotion that helped their ancestors survive. And honestly, this makes a lot of sense because when you think about it, when we still lived in caves, being isolated was a death sentence. You see, without the power of teamwork, our ancestors were less likely to find food, fight off predators, and reproduce. Therefore, evolution programmed us to crave the company of others. What this means is it's perfectly normal to feel lonely because the emotion is hardwired into your DNA. So if you feel lonely because you've recently lost a loved one, you just moved to a new city, or you're single, then there's nothing wrong with you, because in these situations, your biology is designed to make you feel lonely. To take this idea a step further, loneliness also improved the survival rates of children, because if a prehistoric man or woman went off on a hunt and then didn't miss their family, then they'd have no reason to return. And as a result, their children would be less likely to receive protection and food. Ultimately, this concept was life-changing for me. And that's because I went from believing there was something wrong with me to realizing that it was perfectly normal to feel lonely after ending an 8-year relationship. And this simple shift in mindset lifted an enormous weight off my shoulders. I say that because feeling lonely no longer reinforced the belief that there was something wrong with me. Instead, I could feel lonely and then remind myself that it was perfectly normal to feel lonely given my situation. And it was that simple act of self-compassion that helped me break out of the self-defeating loop that I was stuck in. Once that happened, my depression improved, then my behavior improved, and as a result, so did the rest of my life. Okay, so because these concepts are so important, here are the 2 key takeaways from this part of the video. First, we evolved to feel lonely, so there's nothing wrong with you if you experience loneliness. And second, most people think that loneliness is bad because it feels bad. But that's not true. Loneliness only becomes a problem if you let the emotion influence you to do harmful things, like isolate yourself at home or treat people poorly. Okay, before we talk about how to overcome loneliness, I want to talk about what causes loneliness. And that's because understanding the root of a problem can help you solve it. So you might assume that people feel lonely because they're isolated, but it's not that simple. The truth is there are many factors that contribute to loneliness, and I'll share 5 of them. The first factor is genetics. Genetically, some people are more affected by loneliness than others, just like some people are more sensitive to spicy foods. Basically, what this means is we all have an individual need for social connection, and when that need is not met, we begin to feel lonely. This explains why some people are comfortable living relatively secluded lives, while others are not. The second factor that contributes to loneliness is environment. On top of your genetics, your environment also plays a significant role in whether or not you feel lonely. To give you an example, assume that you're 12 years old and your parents moved to a new city. Well, in that case, the combination of leaving your friends and being the new kid would increase your odds of feeling lonely. Likewise, if you outlive your friends or your spouse, then you'll be left in an environment primed for loneliness. Okay, the third factor that leads to loneliness is status. Generally speaking, low-status people are prone to loneliness because they're often rejected by society. And on top of that, many low-status individuals lack the basic social skills needed to connect with others. In contrast, many high-status people feel lonely because they're not relatable. And additionally, many millionaires, billionaires, and celebrities struggle to build sincere relationships because many of the people they meet aren't interested in a genuine relationship. Instead, they're only interested in what the high-status individual has to offer. Okay, the fourth factor that leads to loneliness is the strength of your connections. What's surprising is you can be surrounded by people and still feel lonely. And to understand how this is possible, I want you to consider patients in a nursing home. Around the clock, patients in a nursing home are surrounded by support staff and other patients, but for some reason, many still suffer from loneliness. What this tells us is it's not the number of relationships you have that matters. Rather, it's the quality of relationships you have that matters. In other words, your relationships need substance and depth to overcome loneliness. Thankfully, you don't need a lot of meaningful relationships to make a change. In fact, one strong relationship can help you overcome many of the factors that lead to loneliness. Okay, the fifth factor that leads to loneliness is the 3 dimensions of connectedness. I mentioned the book Loneliness earlier in this video, and in that book, the authors describe 3 dimensions of connectedness that lead to loneliness. The first dimension is intimate connectedness, and it defines your closest relationships. So your spouse, your best friend, or your parents might fit into this dimension. The second dimension is relational connectedness, and it defines a wider circle of family and friends. So your cousins, your friend group, or your coworkers might fit into this dimension. And finally, the third category is collective connectedness, and it defines your broadest relationships. So your affiliation with your university, professional organizations, or even your favorite sports teams could fit into this dimension. Now, typically, your closest relationships are the most important, but failing to satisfy any of the 3 dimensions can lead to loneliness. To give you an example, married people are typically less lonely, but if your spouse prevents you from connecting with your friends, then there's a good chance you'll feel lonely. Personally, I found this concept to be pretty accurate. When I really struggled with loneliness, I was missing an intimate connection, and when I met my wife, things got a lot better. But my wife and I went through a phase where we didn't have a lot of close friends outside of our marriage, and even though we were happy with each other, we still felt lonely at times. Now, thankfully, my wife and I found a new group of friends rather quickly, and as a result, my wife and I haven't really felt lonely for a long time. Okay, now that you understand why we feel lonely, let's discuss 4 ideas that can help you overcome loneliness. Idea number 1 is get your mind right. Some people get stuck in chronic loneliness because of irrational thinking. So thoughts like, there's something wrong with me, I'm unlovable, or I'll never solve this problem, make it nearly impossible to escape the pain of loneliness. And as you've learned, that's what happened to me. In my case, I believed it was wrong to feel lonely, which led me to believe that there was something wrong with me. As a result, I ended up depressed. To give you another example, many people believe that they're unlovable after a relationship ends. In situations like these, you can test your irrational thoughts by asking logical questions. And thankfully, the answer to these questions can change your beliefs and consequently, how you feel. For example, when I asked myself if it was reasonable to feel lonely after ending an 8-year relationship, the obvious answer was yes. As a result, I stopped believing that there was something wrong with me, and I began to feel better. Likewise, if you feel unlovable because your last relationship failed, ask yourself if you love everyone you've ever dated. Now, the answer to that question is almost certainly no. Therefore, it's irrational to think that you're unlovable because one person doesn't love you. Okay, the second idea that can help you overcome chronic loneliness is don't wait to feel better before you take action. In many cases, people have rational reasons to feel lonely. So if you just moved to a new city and you don't have any friends, or you recently lost a loved one, then those are good reasons to feel lonely. If you find yourself in a situation like this, it's easy to get stuck in a rut. And that's because it's miserable to feel lonely or depressed. And when you feel this way, it's unlikely that you'll feel motivated to do anything positive. The big problem here is people in this position say things like, I'll take action once I feel better, or things would be so much easier if I just felt better. And unfortunately, people in this position fall into the trap of believing that life will get better if they wait. But unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. Quality relationships don't just show up on your doorstep. Instead, you build quality relationships one step at a time by taking action. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is easy, because it's not. I know firsthand how hard it is to put on a happy face and go out into the world to meet people when you feel miserable. But if you want to escape the pain of loneliness, you have to build quality relationships by taking action, even when it feels like the last thing you want to do. Okay, the third idea that can help you overcome chronic loneliness is identify any missing dimensions. As you've learned, there are 3 dimensions of connectedness that contribute to feeling lonely. Those are intimate connectedness, relational connectedness, and collective connectedness. Therefore, if you feel lonely, one of the first steps you should take is identifying which dimension of connectedness is missing from your life. Now, the answer to this question will be personal, and it will take some self-reflection, but I'll give you a few pointers that will help you get started. First, studies show that married people are typically less lonely than single people. So if you're single and you're lonely, you might benefit from an intimate relationship. Now, if you're married and you still feel lonely, that could mean one of 2 things. First, maybe your marriage needs work, or second, maybe you need to focus on the other dimensions of connectedness. So that might involve spending more time with friends or joining a meaningful organization. Finally, there will be certain situations where constraints lead to loneliness. So for example, assume a soldier wants a romantic relationship, but he's stationed overseas where there's no women. In this situation, it would be in his best interest to focus on another dimension of connectedness, like his relationship with fellow soldiers. And the fourth and final idea that can help you overcome chronic loneliness is build strong relationships slowly. I mentioned earlier that strong, meaningful relationships aren't built overnight. Therefore, taking a slow and somewhat systematic approach when building relationships can be helpful for 2 reasons. First, doing so prevents you from coming on too strong. And second, a slow approach helps you overcome the fear of rejection. So to help you, here are 4 tips that can help you build strong relationships slowly. Tip number 1 is start small. In their book, The Like Switch, authors Jack Schafer and Marvin Carlins say that 4 factors define the depth of your relationships. Those factors are proximity, frequency, duration, and intensity. Proximity is the physical distance between you and another person. Frequency refers to how often you see that person. Duration defines the length of an individual interaction, and intensity refers to the depth of the interaction, both physically and emotionally. In the early stages of a relationship, overdoing any of the 4 factors will likely do more harm than good. For example, getting too close to someone physically or emotionally before they're ready will make them feel uncomfortable. And at the same time, seeing someone too often or overstaying your welcome will make them feel smothered. Therefore, it's a good idea to start small in the beginning by making simple attempts to connect. To give you a few examples, you might ask a coworker for their opinion, compliment a teammate, or ask a stranger if they like the book they're reading. Now, at this stage, it's important to remember that you're not looking for the love of your life or your best friend in a day. You're just testing the water to see how people respond. If you don't get a good response, that's okay. Try again in a few days or move on. But if you do get a good response, then be sure to connect again in the future. Next, once you get some momentum going, you can strengthen the relationship by increasing the 4 factors: proximity, frequency, duration, and intensity. So if you're building a romantic relationship, you might increase frequency by moving from 1 date per week to 2 dates per week. Or if you're building a friendship with a coworker, you might increase duration and intensity by moving from conversations at work to a fun Saturday night out on the town. Tip number 2 is pick the ideal environment. In general, it's easier to build relationships with people who have similar interests, values, and beliefs. Therefore, you can increase your odds of forming friendships by picking the ideal environment. So if you love cycling, then you'll have good odds of meeting like-minded people if you join a group ride. But in contrast, if you're a die-hard Republican, then it's unlikely that you'll meet your best friend at a Democratic convention. Another thing to note is that the right environment can help you feel less anxious about connecting with people. So if you're shy, it's probably not a good idea to experiment with social connection at a wild frat party. In that case, you might have better luck if you try to connect with people in a calmer environment, perhaps while volunteering at a charity. Tip number 3 is don't take rejection personally. Unfortunately, people won't always welcome your attempts to connect, and that rejection can be painful. When this happens, you want to make sure the rejection doesn't affect your attitude or prevent you from trying to connect with people in the future. It's hard, but to maintain a positive attitude, try not to take the rejection personally. Remember that it's unlikely that the rejection is a judgment of you. Instead, the other person might be busy, stressed, or just not interested in a new relationship. Now, whatever the reason, don't push the issue. Just accept their no and move on. That said, you'll want to learn something from the experience if possible. So if the other person said that they felt overwhelmed, that might be a sign that you came on too quickly. And tip number 4 is expect reciprocation. In the early stages of a relationship, you might need to initiate most of the interactions. And because people typically prefer to talk about themselves, you might have to make most of the conversations about the other person. Now, that said, you want to make sure that the relationship doesn't become one-sided. In a one-sided relationship, one person puts in all the effort. This individual initiates all interactions and does everything on the other person's terms. In fact, if this person stopped putting effort into the relationship, it would cease to exist. Ideally, if you're trying to build a strong relationship, what you're looking for is a relationship that's mutually beneficial. And in a mutually beneficial relationship, both people put in effort. Therefore, if you're trying to build a genuine and meaningful relationship, you should eventually expect some level of reciprocation from the other person. That might be initiating contact, offering help, or asking for your opinion. Ultimately, the main point here is simple. If you're trying to build a meaningful relationship with someone who isn't making effort, it might be time to look elsewhere. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, it would be great if you could subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. Now, if you want more information like this, I highly recommend you check out my meditation app, Aware. I've linked to it below in the description. Thank you, and I'll see you soon.